Hi there, my name is Caitlin. I'm a Senior Grants and Investment Officer in the Community Partnerships team. And today I'm going to be talking through an information session for applicants on our small grants and community chest funds for 2021 and into 2022. So, in this session, I'm going to quickly go over who we are and an overview of the grants program, who can apply, when you can apply, and some key things to note with our rolling rounds. What specifically we can fund, including the general eligibility criteria for both funds, and then we'll dive deeper into small grants and community chest. And most of those things we'll be reading from the guidance. Then we're going to quickly jump into a couple of key questions in the application. And I'm going to give you some hints and tips and pointers around what we're looking for from some of your answers and the best way that you can go about crafting your application. You should note that however we upload this presentation, whether it's through YouTube or disseminated in another way, I'll make sure to include descriptive time codes from kind of each key point so that you don't have to listen to this whole session if you've thoroughly read the guidance and completely understand, but maybe you want a bit more information about how to answer your request description, or how assessors will be looking at your request description, because we'll be going through those kind of things too. So look out for those, because they will be in the vicinity of wherever you're watching this. So just some key terms that I want to establish before we kick off. So I'm going to be using them throughout this presentation. VCS is what we use to describe the voluntary and community sector. When I use the words organization and group, I may use them interchangeably, except for when specifically referring to a structured group of residents. I'm sure you're all aware of the grant agreement, which is a legally binding document that everyone who's successful must sign before funds are released. A schedule sometimes is commonly referred to in grant agreements, and that's a part of a grant agreement, and it might be a copy of the application you submit or a budget. And request. So when we speak about request, we are talking about your request for funding. And this is often used interchangeably with the words project or application. So quickly, who we are. Our community partnerships team, we're situated in the Chief Executive's Department of Hackney Council. So there's 4 of us, Sarah, Moyo, Lisa, and I. And we coordinate and manage the Place for Everyone grants programs. So we've got 5 funding streams available. We've got our main grants, which we've already distributed for this year. And then we have our small grants in our community chest. These are the ones that we'll be speaking about today. And they are 1-year grants of up to $10,000 or $1,000. We also have specialist grants. So these are 2-year large grants for infrastructure organisations in Hackney. And then we also have a suite of social welfare advice grants, and these are large grants for advice services in Hackney. We've done a lot of grant making since COVID. We went through waves 2 to 5 of the London Community Response Fund and gave over $1.2 million in emergency funding to Hackney. So just touching briefly, our grants program is set on some key priorities relating to equalities. And for these 2 funds that we're looking at today, a key eligibility criteria is to demonstrate how your project fits in with these 2 priorities here. And these are some ways that you might want to refine those there. So we'll keep speaking to those as we go along. So quick overview, the 2 funds that we're discussing today are the Community Chest and the Small Grants. While these funds are separate, they share a guidance document because of the basic similarities of who can apply, when you can apply, and the equalities objectives. They then differ in the amounts that you can apply for. So, who can apply? We accept applications from unregistered community groups, CIOs, registered charities, charitable companies, CICs, social enterprises, and structured groups of residents for community chest. So this table here, taken from page 3 of the guidance, maps out some of the key documents or structures that highlight the difference between a registered organisation and a structured group of residents. So we'll just delve a little bit deeper into what is a structured group of residents and why do we fund them. So this is a group of people who are not registered as a charitable organisation in any way. They might be an established group who've been meeting for a number of years, or they might be a group who's recently formed for a very specific purpose or event. So we've got some examples there on the screen. And if you think you might be a structured group of residents, I would suggest coming back to this table here in your own time and just clearly seeing whether or not you think that you have those ones there. And now, if your organisation is a social enterprise or a community interest company, you're only eligible to apply for our grants if you are legally required to operate on a non-for-profit basis. And typically this means that 100% of your funds are reinvested back into the organisation. Any executive directors or trustees operate in a completely voluntary capacity and they are not paid shareholders. And usually, as an indicator of the above, there's a no profit distribution clause in your governing documents and or an asset lock. Now, if you're unsure, or maybe you think you have one and not the other, or there's many different ways that these governing documents are structured, don't hesitate to contact us with what you think maybe your concerns are, and preferably with what you would use as proof to demonstrate that you are non-for-profit. And we will let you know what category that you should tick. So, when to apply? So this table describes what we refer to as rolling rounds. And these are rounds that are set up to accept applications at any time and then assess them at numerous times throughout the year. This is intended to give you more flexibility over when you might want to submit an application. Once you know when you want your project to start, you should really consult this table to understand when the best time might be to apply. For example, if you have a project that's going to start in August, then you need to apply by the 15th of June. If you have a project that you want to start in November, then you need to apply by the 27th of July. You can apply at any time for any of these start dates. So, for example, you could apply tomorrow for a project that doesn't start until January. What we'll do in this instance is we'll vet the application, make sure it's eligible. If it's not eligible or there's any errors, we may send it back to you for resubmission. And we will schedule it for the panel on the 21st of November in this instance. What you do need to understand is that we won't contact you at any time to confirm this until the 10th of December 2020. So please do just consider that. When to apply? Some key things to note. If your application is missing documentation that is required or is not submitted if we request it, we may withdraw it. Please read the appendix carefully and ensure that all required documents are submitted. While you can submit your application at any time, applications will only be assessed at the panel closest to the start dates. So there's no limit to the number of times an unsuccessful applicant can apply to the funds. We encourage applicants in this case to seek feedback on why their application was unsuccessful in the first instance before applying. And of course, if we go back and consult our when to apply table, if you were unsuccessful in this submission round and you wanted to apply again for this submission round, you might need to relook at the dates of your project. So now we're going to look at what we can fund. And this is really important for applicants to think about the key eligibility or the essential criteria that you need in order to have your application be successful in any case. So when we're talking about essential criteria, we're talking about things you must demonstrate in your application in order to be successful. It's very important to ensure that your application clearly addresses all of these things. Now, for both small grants and community chest, we have the same essential criteria. And this is that projects should be for short-term activities or one-off projects. Projects can be no longer than 1 year in length from the start date, and that 80% of the beneficiaries that are intended for this grant must be Hackney residents. And what you do have to do in your application, which we'll speak to later, is you have to demonstrate how this project will achieve one or both of those grant program objectives that we spoke about before. Remember, key eligibility is that you must have an annual income under £250,000 to apply. So if your organisation and your project clearly meets these criteria, we then just need to consider which fund that you want to apply for. So our small grants purpose is to fund short-term activities that meet one or both of those grants program objectives. So very, very broad. We welcome a whole range of applications for a whole range of projects. So specifically to small grants, there are some conditions. Applications for holiday play schemes should be clearly identified, and all holiday play schemes should be classified as small grants. Organisations can't hold more than one small grant in a year unless the second small grant is for a holiday play scheme. So if you are successful in getting a small grant funded in, say, the July panel, you can't apply again in January 2022. You have to wait for our next round of funding to come out. Your organisation can't apply for a small grant if it's received one for 3 consecutive years, unless this is a holiday play scheme. So, clearly we've got some restrictions on the amount of small grants you can hold, but for holiday play scheme, it's much more fluid. And structured groups of residents cannot apply for small grants. So we'll go through the classification of our application forms in not very long, and we just need to be clear that if you're a structured group of resident, you cannot apply for small grants. So applications need to be for projects between £1,000 and £10,000, and projects can last no longer than a year from the project start date. Moving on to Community Chest. So the purpose of Community Chest is to fund hyperlocal, short-term or one-off activities that meet one or both of the program objectives. The key differences to small grants are that we are really looking for hyper-local, and that is indicative really with the fact that we will allow structured groups of residents to apply, and that the maximum grant award will be £1,000. So if you apply for more than £1,000 for a Community Chest application, we will ask you to change your application to a small grant if it is eligible, and to resubmit your application. If, for example, you're a structured group of residents and you submit an application for more than £1,000, your application will not be eligible because this would be outside the guidance and it will be withdrawn. So another just key thing to note on this is that 50% of available funding for Community Chest will be ring-fenced for very small organisations with an annual income of £50,000 or less. What we can't fund. So hopefully it's clear by now that we don't fund anything that doesn't meet the application criteria, and that we have those restrictions around small grants. What we also won't fund is any retrospective applications. So this is when the project has already taken place or will take place before the 26th of July. Again, it's very important to consult those tables. So if you apply for a project in the first round and potentially it was unsuccessful, and then you applied again in the next round, if the project dates were outside of the months that when projects can start by, that would be considered a retrospective application. So we would not be funding that. Again, we can't fund anything that lasts beyond 1 year from the project start date. We can't fund any capital expenses, so building renovations or refurbishments. We won't fund any activities for religious or politically oriented purposes, although we always welcome applications from religious groups for inclusive community activities. We won't fund the purchase of alcohol or activities in which alcohol consumption is the predominant theme. And we won't fund applications for an individual or when it's clear that an individual receives the main benefit of this. And we won't fund any contingencies or contingent liabilities. Now, I'm sure you're well aware of, contingency funding, just placing some funding aside in case of unforeseen circumstances. But contingent liabilities are a bit more nuanced, and these are potential liabilities that may or may not occur. So you couldn't put in your application to cover the cost of, a warranty on equipment that you've bought, or potential legal fees that you may face if something went awry. So that's it. Really, really quick. Thank gosh. What we're going to do now is I'm going to show you just how to access your account and the application form. And then I'm going to come back to my presentation, and I'm going to focus on a couple of the key questions. We're going to go through what we're looking for and some hints and tips for applying for those. And I'm also going to show you roughly what the assessors use to score those applications. So I think quite helpful. So let me just figure out how to make sure that you can see what I am seeing. Okay, so if you have absolutely never applied for a grant but with us before, the best place to go is our community partnerships website. If you have applied or you already have started your application, then you should have an email with a direct link. But if in doubt, always just go to our community partnerships website. So this is where we put everything to do with our grants program. Now, what you want to do is you want to scroll down to our how to apply section, and you want to click apply now or continue your application. So because I'm already logged in, that's taken me directly to the form. If I was to log out, it would take me back to our main page, and I could go in and click apply now, and it's just going to prompt me to sign in. So key things to note with this application form. One are that sometimes people have trouble submitting it with different browsers. So we really recommend that you always have a separate document open, and you just either, draft your responses in there or copy and paste any responses from the form onto there. That means that if anything goes awry, you're always going to have those, answers that you spend a lot of time on there for you. And we really encourage you to regularly save your work, again, just in case anything happens with the internet, because the application form will save all of the details that you put in. So if you do, if your internet cuts out and, everything kind of crashes, when you go back in, if you've been saving it, you're not going to have to put in all that information again. So the first thing that I just want to ensure that everyone does properly is that you select the correct grant. And that's really important, because if you select the wrong grant, for example, if you selected a community chest grant here and then also a holiday play scheme, that would not be eligible, because as we've already established, you can't apply for a community chest grant and with a holiday play scheme. Just like if you applied for a community chest grant and your budget at the end of the application was for more than 1,000, and maybe you accidentally clicked that and you were meant to do small grants. If you did that, one would be ineligible and one would be eligible. So let's just really make sure that that happens properly. Another nitty-gritty thing that I did just want to go over is the project start and end dates. So this is going to prompt you to your little calendar. It's not going to allow you to put anything before the 26th of July, because that is the earliest that any project can start and be eligible. And it is going to ask you to set your own project date. Now, just remember that this cannot be more than a year. So again, like the categorization, if you accidentally, select it so it's more than a year, that would technically make your grant ineligible. So just paying close attention to those things. And just a note, I want to just bring your attention to this. This is an error. That should be July. My apologies. So, and a note on the total number of beneficiaries. This is for the entirety of your project. This isn't for the 80% of Hackney residents. So, when we look at your applications as assessors, we'll do our own maths about roughly, what that 80% looks like. So, put the whole amount in there because that really helps us to understand, things like value for money. So, as you can imagine, if you applied for a project and the total cost of the project was, let's say, £5,000, but you maybe only put 80% of the Hackney residents in there, maybe then that wouldn't translate very well to value for money because we're not getting the full picture of how many people it's costing you to run that project. So, your request description. This is the big one. This is the one that is going to tell us everything about what you want to do and probably the one that you're going to spend, almost the most time on. So, we need to get this one right. As a guide, by the end of this question, assessors should clearly understand what, how, who, and why, what the project is and what it will achieve, how the project will achieve that, and how this will be delivered, who the project will benefit, and how are Hackney residents being targeted? And, do you want to speak to that 80% in that how are Hackney residents being targeted? Why this project is needed, and why are you best placed to deliver it? If it targets a specific group, that is absolutely fine. This should be linked back to why that group specifically needs this. Some other things you might want to note. Where did the need come from? So you've put why you need it. Where did that come from? How do you know that you need it? Can you evidence that? All things that might make your application a little bit clearer or stronger. And in terms of scoping out whether other groups are doing similar activities, do not be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid in your application, to say such and such is doing this. We understand that. And the reason that we also want to do this is because our service users are different. If anything, that's going to give assessors more confidence that you understand the needs of your service users. So, some more tips. The most important thing to consider when writing this is, have you covered that what, how, who, and why? And I'm going to show you some examples in a moment. Don't be afraid to use bullet points. If you think this is the clearest way to get across your project, especially with small projects and ones with limited word counts, do not be afraid to use bullet points. Try not to repeat yourself. If you've covered all of these and you still have 300 words left, absolutely fine. Don't feel the need to add more. Remember that assessors are people, and they're people who are potentially reading hundreds of applications. So make it easy for them. They're going to thank you for not repeating yourself. Have someone who knows very little about the project, just like an assessor would, read your application, but particularly this section. If they are missing key details or they're confused about any element of the project or what you are doing, then you know the assessor will be too. Speaking briefly about proportionality, we do want to mention that we assess in proportion. So we would never expect the same level of detail from a £500 application to a £9,500 application. Considering what it takes to articulate, this how, what, who, why, the key details and risks and expenses, for example, for a one-day community drop-in session. And then considering the same thing for a £9,000 holiday play scheme over 3 weeks in summer for 50 disadvantaged children across 3 different sites in Hackney. Naturally, there's going to be a clear difference in detail that would be required. So if you are putting in a very small application, and you feel like you've said everything, you've covered all of this, but you've used so few words, absolutely, don't worry, because we are assessing with that proportionality in mind. This is how assessors will be looking at your answers to determine success. And so what happens is assessors give a rating to each section, and then they give an overall rating to the application, based on all of these individual ratings. So it goes from insufficient through to very good. Insufficient is not a good score. Essentially, we're saying that you didn't give us enough information or clarity to even make an assessment. It was completely insufficient. With the best being very good. Now, if we just look at good here, the answer is mainly clear, but it might slightly fall down on some aspects as some elements are not explained. Maybe that was why the project is needed and why they needed that. But they did, the who, what, and, all of that kind of thing. So what will happen is assessors will note what was missing, and that's probably what they will use to discuss at panel in comparison to other applications. Now, if maybe you missed something in this section, but you completely cleared it up in another section, then, the overall, rating of the application is, going to reflect that. The assessor is clear on what you want to do, even if maybe it wasn't explicitly stated in this specific section. So don't worry about that. So this is a real answer from a previous community chest application. I'm not going to read it out. Feel free to pause me and read it. And essentially, this answer tells us who the project beneficiaries are, but doesn't tell us how many. It doesn't give us any information about why the project is needed. It says what the programs are that have been requested by users, but it doesn't go into detail of what they will deliver, how they'll deliver it, and why they need it. All key things we have hopefully already established are required for this section to score well. This is another real answer from a community chest application in October, and it was a strong answer. It was a successful application overall. And this answer is clear that the project is to deliver 36 hours of workshops over 12 weeks. That's the what. It then discusses the beneficiary groups. That's the who. It says what the outcome of the workshops will be, which is the what they want to achieve. And, this is a real answer. So, it's not perfect, but to be even stronger, it could have gone into more detail as to why these sessions are needed and maybe drawn in some local context as to how they know that. And that's that why that we've been talking about. So the next section that we want to speak to is another key section, and that's how this project works towards those grant program aims that we've already spoken about. This is an essential criteria to be successful. You have to link your project to these aims. Essentially, we want to fund projects that aligns with our aims and values. We want you to tell us how your project aligns with those. And in this question, you should demonstrate how the project will work to do this. In terms of scoring for this question, again, we have our same scale, and a very good answer will clearly show the link between the project and one or more of the aims and how it positively contributes to these. Now, a vague or a waffly answer to this might suggest to us that maybe you haven't considered this project in line with the aims of what we are looking for. Another example of a weak answer. So this one does not make any reference to those objectives explicitly or implicitly. You don't have to, copy and paste or use that same terminology. We can read between the lines, and this doesn't do either. It doesn't also show any link between their project and supporting the wider community. A strong answer. This one clearly outlines how the project aligns with these equality aims, and it very strongly links this to specific details of the project and how this will impact their beneficiaries. Now, I've put 197 words down there, I guess just to hammer home that this has got 500 words in this word count. Absolutely, a strong answer can be done in, under 200 words. Project management, excuse me. This is another key meaty question, and we're essentially wanting to know your ability to deliver this project. Even the most fantastic project will not be successful if the organization has poor project management capability. As grants officers who manage lots and lots of grants, we see this all the time, and that's why it's a crucial question. So we want you to tell us about how you'll effectively plan and manage the delivery of this project. And we also want to know who the staff or volunteers will be that are delivering the project. And you want to include any particular skills or experiences that might be needed to do that. So, for example, if you are doing a one-day drop-in session, about community mental health, we want to know that the person who is giving that, advice in whatever form is suitably qualified to do so. Just putting in your application, such and such will be paid X to do this is not going to fill us with confidence that we are funding people who are qualified. And that's very important. Project management, how it will be scored. Again, our insufficient to very good, with our very good answer being it's very clear on how the project will be managed, who will be involved, and what relevant skills and experience they bring. If you were to put in a good answer, the difference would be that they start to provide further detail on those relevant skills and experiences, but maybe don't fully, clarify what that is. Another example. So this answer mentions the experience of the organization's founder, but it doesn't make any explicit link of that to the project they've applied for. There's no information in there about how the project will be managed or the organization's track record. This is an example of a strong answer, and I did have to cut this down a little bit just to fit it on the slide, but I think it still clearly is a strong answer. It shows their organization's background in the field. It talks about the relevant skills and experiences of their staff, their volunteers, and their trustees to manage the project. They give information on how their projects are managed, and they link in with some governance structures such as auditing and their quality marks down here. And that demonstrates that their management practices are verifiably good. Now, not everyone can have all these marks. We don't expect people to, but if you have them or you're working towards them, absolutely include that in this section. So the next, word heavy, I think the last word heavy section is project risk. Now, all projects, whether they are tiny or they're large, they do present risks. And we want you to complete, a bit of a risk identification or a risk assessment, clearly outlining what risks you think may occur and how these will be mitigated. Now, not all of our assessors are going to be experts in, risk management or risk strategy. So what we are looking for is the main risks, the common sense risks, the risk that assessor who doesn't know anything about your project thinks, oh, there's probably a bit of a safeguard risk there if they're working with very, very vulnerable young people. So we want you to identify those risks, assess the probability of this happening, and then articulate how you're going to mitigate this in practice. This doesn't need to be, text heavy. We're looking for just very simple mitigation strategies. And X is a risk. X has a, moderate likelihood of happening. If X does happen, this is what we will do. Now, we don't have a specific example of this because, risks just vary so much from project to project, but this is how they will be scored. So a weak answer will provide some reference to risks, but maybe it doesn't then follow through and address how they'll be dealt with. And a good answer will clearly acknowledge the main risks, and it has a clear and appropriate response for each one. Project budget. Key things to consider. Make sure you click the calculator button. Maybe I will take you into our application form if you'll bear with me for 1 second, just so you can visualize how this is going to work and what I say when I mean click the calculator button. When you're submitting your actual application, you should read these. They're very important. Let's go through to our budget. Okay, so this is our budget table. The reason that we have a table like this and not an upload is because what we always see is people, uploading things. We have upload errors as, the starting point, documents that we can't see properly, workings that we don't understand how they got there. But pretty much the main reason is that often people outline their expenditure and their expenses, and then when we go through and add them up, they're wrong. And straight off the bat, you cannot get a good score for a budget that just doesn't add up properly. So we've kind of taken, that risk out of it for you. And essentially, all you need to do is give us an overview of what it is that this expenditure will be, how much you need from London Borough of Hackney, and maybe how much you're applying from other sources. Key things to understand here is when you go down and you click the calculator icon, it's going to show you the total project cost. So this is how much you're saying it's going to cost you to run the project as a whole. And then it's going to give you a different amount for the total request from London Borough of Hackney. So that's all of these combined, 960. So if I've selected community chest, I know that when assessors read my application, they're going to clearly see that it costs a little bit more, but that I've read and understood the guidance, and I know I can only apply for £960. We also have a budget notes section here. So if you run out of words in here, feel free to go down there and explain in more detail any of those items. So we've made sure that you know why to click the calculator button. Essentially in this section, we're looking to gain a really good understanding of how the project that you've just spent so long describing looks financially. We want to understand how these operational aspects that you've mentioned will be implemented through a budget. As the people who, are managing funding, this is quite an important section to us. The budget should represent the whole project, not just what's being requested through Hackney Council, and we hope that the budget calculator will help applicants to make sure that they do this. We also want to make sure that any salary payments should aim to meet the London living wage. Now, we know that's not always possible. We know that that's going to take time, but absolutely do not be afraid to put the London living wage in your application. Now, the project budget is a great opportunity to bring your application together. It is one of the most important elements, and you should not be scared of a project budget. It should be the cherry on top of the sundae, essentially. It should completely link to the narrative that you have provided. It is never a good idea to introduce any new information in the form of expenses or leave out any key detail. For example, you've got a cost in your budget for 10 student laptops, but you have nowhere in your narrative explicitly mentioned that you're serving 20 participants and you expect that 10 of them won't have access to a laptop at home. So you're going to buy 10 and you're going to ensure that they have access to those. If that hasn't been made clear, when an assessor sees that, they're going to think, hang on a second, have I missed something? And they haven't missed something. You've just introduced new information into this budget section. If in doubt as well, whether or not you should break down your budget items further, it never hurts to give more clarity, but it can hurt not to. I'll give an example of salaries here. This is a key one that people fall down on. Make sure that you explain those salaries. So youth worker salaries equals 7,500. That gives us absolutely no information. But if you simply put 5 times youth worker salaries at 25 per hour for 15 hours per week over 4 weeks, 7,500, we have so much more information, which will probably really clarify when you were talking about your youth workers. It will really clarify when they're working, how long they're working, and how much they're working for. So, as well here, consider what you're asking for in proportion to your organization size. This is really important, but I think it's often missed. So, assessors are looking to see if an organization is well placed to manage the size of the grant they're asking for. So you need to think about this when costing your project. If you're an organization with an annual income of £5,000 and you apply for a grant of £10,000, this is double your existing annual income. And assessors may question the suitability of awarding you a grant that size. It's somewhat risky. If you're applying for a grant that is proportionately a lot larger than your annual income, and our rule is anything above 30%, we tend to create a system where we can automatically flag that. You need to justify this throughout your application. Growth is a really important part of an organization when it's starting. We get it, we understand it. But if you are, applying for something that's proportionately larger, you really do just need to justify that in your application. In terms of scoring, let's go down to the very good. The costs provided are thorough, they're detailed, they're realistic, based on the information you've given us. The expenses clearly link to the narrative, and it enhances the overall clarity of the project asks. And a weak answer, so it provides some cost breakdown, but not enough detail, and or maybe the costs are unrealistic. Maybe you've asked for £5,000 for 10 laptops. If you have good reason for asking for that, that's when you want to justify it in that budget section. The links to the narrative are somewhat clear, however, new information has been introduced or key information has been left out. And this makes the project as a whole unclear. Right, we've come to the end. What documentation you'll need. As I said earlier, what happens next after you have done your key information is that we ask you to attach a whole bunch of documentation. And it's really important to do this because if you are successful in getting a grant, then we can say you've been successful. Here's your grant agreement. We don't need to go back and forth asking for all of these things. So you're going to submit them all to us. We're going to check them before it goes to panel. And then if you are successful, we're going to get